Over the course of the past year, I've attended a number of conferences and read a number of very thoughtful pieces about how technology can improve access to justice. I have drawn from them a list of 5 requirements, things that I think are necessary if technology is going to realize its potential to really improve access to justice. My list is not original with me. It's based on a distillation of what I've heard from others, a combination of what I've heard from others. So I'd like to tell you what the 5 things are that, if we could accomplish them, would make a significant dent in the yawning justice gap in our country. The first is the need for what Margaret Hagan has called a network to build a global strategic blueprint for access to justice technology. She's also called it a meta-collaboration. I would break Margaret's proposal down into 2 components. This is my inference from what she says and not her words. I think we need a global clearinghouse of information about who is doing what in technology, both in the for-profit and the nonprofit sectors. I am not aware of any single repository of information about technology and access to justice that is accessible and has global information available to people. I am not aware of such a tool in the United States, let alone globally. What we need is a comprehensive catalog of who is doing and has done what, together with an assessment of the value of that work. As Roger Smith noted in a blog post last September, of all the emerging issues, what would be the most important? The mapping, he said, and the evaluation of all the initiatives currently underway. He went on to say, even some rudimentary information would be extremely helpful as those around the world struggle to learn the lessons from often distant jurisdictions. The second component of this meta-collaboration that I see is a network to build a global strategic blueprint, a mechanism for setting priorities, for developing a master plan, rather than proceeding with the siloed and dispersed development of 37,000 apps, a modus operandi often driven by the interests of individuals and developers or by the happenstance of local one-off needs. The challenge of meeting this need, of course, is deciding who can and should do this. We need a host, an owner, a sponsor, an organization or a consortium with the credibility and the financial capacity to do this. The second need that I think emerges from current thinking is a need for a clear-eyed recognition of the limits of technology to solve access to justice problems. We need to acknowledge, as Dame Hazel Genn has noted, that there will always be some segment of the population, maybe the segment most in need, that technology will not be able to help. We also need to acknowledge that legal process reform must proceed in sync with the development of technology. If technology is to realize its potential to improve access to justice, as Richard Susskind has emphasized, current legal process must change. Richard has noted that that process is incomprehensible to most people. It requires, he says, the equivalent of a 2,000-page user's manual just to explain it. Technology cannot solve the complexity built into our current legal system. As Shannon Salter, our keynote speaker this morning, has said, Technology invites us to rethink everything we do in the justice system, offline as well as online. We need to avoid the temptation to focus only on technology because process reform is too daunting and will take too long. But as one observer put it, we have to make law less complex and more workable. Lawyers have been paid and paid well, he said, to proliferate subtleties and complexities. It is about time we brought our intellectual resources to bear on eliminating some of those intricacies. The speaker was Attorney General Robert Kennedy, speaking on Law Day, May 1st, 1964, at the University of Chicago Law School. I don't think the situation has improved in the 56 intervening years. I think it's gotten worse. Those working on technology are often well positioned to spot the procedural complexity we need to change. Third is the need to collaborate much more broadly, starting with lawyers, technologists, the courts, regulators, and legal academics, but beyond them, with people who are not part of the conventional access to justice community. I'm talking about public librarians, healthcare providers, academics beyond law faculties, engineers, management experts, social services providers. I think we still don't have the right people at the table. Of one thing I'm certain, an innovation initiative led by lawyers is an oxymoron. Lawyers are not good at innovation. They are too risk-averse, self-protective, prone to focusing on problems, and too wedded to precedent to be able to drive change at scale. We always need to ask, who is not here in the room from whom we could learn? Fourth is the obvious and perennial need for funding. We are resource-starved. We need to be creative here. I am regularly struck by the lack of cross-fertilization between the for-profit legal tech sector and the nonprofit legal tech sector. I think we have not mined the prospect of in-kind contributions from the for-profit sector, both technology companies and law firms. I detect a willingness in that sector to share know-how, to share software, to share hardware, to improve access to justice. Last June, for example, DLA Piper, the second largest law firm in the world, convened a global summit on access to justice and technology in London. And there, the firm offered to make its own technology resources and know-how available to the access to justice movement. I think there are other firms out there who would be willing to make similar commitments. And the fifth need is for leadership. We need leadership to build a global strategic blueprint if we're going to create and curate that clearinghouse of information about legal technology, if we're going to set and build consensus for a set of priorities, if we're going to accomplish process simplification that must accompany technology development, if we're going to tap the funding necessary to achieve change at scale. This requires leadership at a grand level. No major change happens without strong leadership, individual leadership as well as institutional leadership. We need to systematically identify people who have both the power and the inclination, the personal inclination, to lead change in access to justice, and to cultivate people who have the power but have not yet developed the personal inclination to help. I'm thinking of people like Justice Dino Himonas of the Utah Supreme Court, who has both the power and the inclination to lead change. He is leading dramatic change in regulatory form in his home state, and he is willing to try to enlist support from fellow Supreme Court justices across the United States. We need to find more people like him. We need to partner with them and then work with them to proselytize, to conscript peers, and expand the movement. We need leaders who will think big, who are willing to craft and implement solutions commensurate with the magnitude of the problem, and recognize the urgency of the crisis in our system today. That ultimately should be our goal. Change at scale. Solutions commensurate with the magnitude of the problem, pursued with the urgency that the crisis and access to justice demands. I came to LSC 9 years ago this month. The experience has radicalized me. I think it is an outrage that millions and millions of Americans, year after year, are unable to assert and vindicate their legal rights. This is the United States of America. That is wrong. We cannot let the persistence and the enormity of the access to justice problem anesthetize us to its human consequences, to cause us to accept the status quo as the inevitable result of inadequate legal aid funding. We cannot afford to tolerate the continued degradation of justice to the detriment of the disadvantaged. If any group can rise to this challenge, it is you here in this room. You have the creativity, the passion, the vision, the energy, the optimism, the faith, and the hope to drive change. Let's set the world on fire, because we know what's at stake. What's at stake is what Alexander Hamilton described as the first duty of society: justice. Thank you. Thank you.